Hello, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us today. I'm Jane Robertson from Frog Systems and your host for this event on Time to Talk Day, the nation's biggest conversation about mental health. Well, there's no doubt that mental health has become a big talking point over the past couple of years, not just because of the pressures we're all under because of the pandemic, but also because of the number of celebrities and sports stars who've also started to speak more openly about what they've been through. But what does a good conversation about mental health look like? And how do we encourage those we know, our friends, our colleagues in work, our teammates in sport and family members to be more comfortable about opening up? Well, I'm joined today by three guests who can guide us through all of this. Toluwa Oyeleye, an international wellbeing and leadership coach, TEDx speaker and trainer who helps people become a healthier version of themselves. Heather Kelly, also a TEDx speaker and founder of Aura Wellbeing. Heather led the development of the Workplace Wellbeing Index, defining best practice in workplace mental health for the charity Mind. And Mark Boyns, a busy teacher who, after the loss of a friend and teammate, founded the charity Opening Up Cricket. And he now runs sessions to promote positive mental health to players, clubs and coaches. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today. And as always, everybody, if you have any questions, please do drop them into the chat as we go along. So starting with our guest then, Toluwa, why is it important to open up a conversation about mental health?
Oh, straight into the deep question. Why is it important to open up a conversation about mental health? I think that's what I needed for my mental well-being when I was working in international development, and to everybody else, it looked like I was okay. And the normal question is, how are you doing? And you just respond fine. And people end it then, you start talking about the weather. But I think even if it was just one person that allowed me to know that there was something called mental well-being, there was a conversation like mental health, and it wasn't, I guess it might, at that time, maybe it had more stigma than it does now, to be fair. But just a conversation would have gone a long way to ask more questions, to see where help is at. That wasn't with the NHS alone. But, you know, what other spaces can provide this sort of conversations and support? That would have been really useful for me. So I think it goes a long way, is what I would say.
And Heather, how about you? I mean, you've done a lot of work with the charity Mind over previous years, which is all about, you know, opening up these types of conversations. Why do you think they're so important?
And ultimately, we all have mental health, just like we have physical health. And if we think about our day-to-day lives right now, is there any day that you live that you don't talk about COVID? It affects our physical health, you know, I mean, and so that's, I mean, I think that's the strongest message, is that, you know, we're not socialized, or, you know, we're not educated, you know, in school and primary education to talk about our mental health, but we are taught that it's good and normal to talk about physical health and check in with people, see how they're doing. So this is why it's really important to try to shift this. And a day like today, Time to Talk Day, really has been helping, I mean, for many years now, to be a platform for starting the conversations, which oftentimes can be hard, but it's a really important reminder that we do all have mental health, like we have physical health. And just like when we talk and share about our physical health problems, and we can get support and feel, you know, some sense of relief, it's the same effect with mental health.
I was going to bring in Mark there, but he's just disappeared. So we'll wait for Mark to come back. Mark is in a very busy school, and the connection is slightly off at the moment. So hopefully Mark will be able to kind of log back on and join us in a moment, because Mark has done a lot to obviously help men open up. And, you know, that's one thing that is, you know, can still be problematic, isn't it? The, you know, encouraging men to be as open as perhaps us women are sometimes about how we're feeling about things, Toluwa.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's interesting, as Heather was speaking, I can see Mark is just coming through. But as just quickly, is actually sometimes people don't know how to respond. So sometimes that's a challenge there that hopefully if we have time, we can explore today. So you open up that conversation, but with physical health, it's easy to be like, oh yeah, I do go to the gym twice a week. I recommend this gym. But with mental health, is that response that might also be a challenge. I'll be interested to talk about that as well.
Mark, we were just sort of saying there that men traditionally are very reluctant to kind of open up, and that's something that you've worked very hard on through really a devastating experience that you had with the loss of a friend, but realizing that actually those conversations, those everyday conversations with people that you're playing sport with, are so important. Oh, that's such a shame, Mark. We're still having a problem connecting to you, so we'll try and pick that up with you. And if we can't connect properly today, then we'll definitely have another conversation with you at some stage. So, Heather, I know that you very much work in the workplace.
Getting me involved in the conversation earlier. I think what sport gives us in terms of this area, and particularly.
Oh, Mark, that's such a shame. We'll carry on the conversation and hopefully get a better connection to you. I do apologise, everybody, because we really want to hear what Mark's got to say.
I'm happy to just chime in a little bit about.
Yeah, please do, Heather. Yeah, absolutely.
Men,
there's plenty of men in the workplace as well, which is something that you specialise in.
Yeah, but I do think there's such value actually in the connection between sport, and of course women and men both play sport, but sport actually has been a really successful place to for especially with sports that men play just amongst men. It's very much it's the guy's experience, and in recent years there have been a lot of professional athletes who've come out and talked about their own experiences with their mental health, and certainly with lots of young men or even grown men who really idolize these individuals and think of them as figures that are like superhuman in some way. They realize that they're not. They're human too, and all of those pressures that an athlete is under, in the same way that we would be under pressures at work or as a parent or whatnot. But it has really broken the stigma a lot, I think, with men, with professional athletes speaking out about their experiences, and broken some boundaries and gotten a lot more men talking. I'm sure Mark was going to share more about some of these charities and causes and things that are really trying to blend kind of mental health and sport, and allow that to try to help us at a social level, to kind of open up the conversation more amongst men.
So can we sort of maybe explore between us what does a good conversation about mental health actually look like? How do you foster that? We're talking on on a Zoom call, on a platform. We're not face to face. Talking is often easier face to face. How do you do it when you're not in the same room with somebody? How do we approach that? Heather, do you want to pick up there?
Sure. Well, I think there's two questions there. One is how, what does a good conversation about mental health look like? And I think that Toluwa made a really good point in saying that maybe it's well and good to say, oh yes, it's time to talk today. Let's talk about mental health, but we're not equipped on how to have that conversation, right? Or how to respond because we feel nervous or uncomfortable. We haven't done this before. So this is what I'd say, and I'd love to hear what Toluwa has to say as well. I think just with any subject where maybe it's a tricky subject, opening it up in a way that feels safe to the other person is, I think, really important. So it doesn't even have to be. Today, it's a fantastic platform, and there's so many in workplaces, particularly, it's very explicit. Like, let's talk about mental health today, and companies set up, free tea and cookies in the kitchen and try to get people down. And there might be conversation starters, prompts, and things like that, which is great. But if we're not on time to talk day, just asking somebody like how you are, like Toluwa said. But if you get a sense that they're not okay, like, ask again, and just say, like, maybe just, oh, how's your week going? Is everything okay with your family? Or and if you feel comfortable to say something about how you're doing, if you're comfortable talking about your mental health, just being honest, that actually can really help also, like, break some of those, the fear or anxiety somebody might have about sharing. So I think those are some tools, but also I think listening is just so important. Patience and listening when somebody does share, and just holding space for that individual.
Yeah, and Toluwa, just sort of getting you to pick up on that. Like we said, we're talking about it, saying you've got to have a conversation about your mental health today. Actually, it doesn't have to be a conversation about your mental health, does it? It just has to be an opportunity to encourage somebody to maybe open up a little bit. How are you doing? All that sort of stuff. It's just a simple thing to do, but it can lead to a much, more important conversation.
Absolutely. And I think there's something important here as well, which is as humans, and, we tend to share what's on our mind with people that we trust, right? So actually trust is a foundation for so many things. Like even when we're talking about mental health, because that's going to look different to different people, your background, your experiences, your race, your sexuality, all of that sort of, has a story and narrative on what we were talking about with mental health. But when someone has that level of trust and relationship in the workplace or in your personal life, even with workshops or time to talk days like this, or that one-to-one base, is easier for someone to open up. And so when, like, Heather asked a question to me about how you feeling, I'm more likely to talk about how I'm feeling today. Actually, I'm feeling a bit low because I already trust Heather. So actually, I think that the work we have to do as organizations and individuals, even in our personal life, is how are we actually building that trust in our relationships? Because it goes back to that other point in terms of, in my head, how I see it with conversations is that first bit being the trust, but the second bit of actually people not feeling like they have the resources to reply. And actually sometimes with conversations like this, you start talking about your mental health and the response to that other person, they feel like they have to have a solution. But actually, with what Heather was saying, a lot of the time it's just about the space. The space you're giving people to talk about it, and not even have to say things like I understand, because maybe you don't, because it's that person's experience. So I think even just that space, and then allowing that person whenever they're ready to say, I can explore this with you if you want to, what resources are out there, what support is out there if you want to later on. But thank you for sharing this with me. In face, and that could be virtual. In face to face, that might be a hug. Whatever that might be. But I think sometimes it's just the space that a lot of us need.
Yeah, and we've just been asked a question there. Thanks, Declan, for that. Should we approach this conversation differently in person versus virtually, which was something we were alluding to earlier? It's all well and good if you could go into the kitchen and have a coffee and just chit chat. But when you're forced to see each other on a screen, maybe especially if you're in a work environment, how on earth do you spot that maybe somebody's on a screen? There's a lot of you on the screen. You notice that maybe a colleague isn't looking so engaged, or maybe quite so happy as everybody else is. How do we conquer that? Heather, do you want to, because you do a lot of workplace strategy, don't you? So are there sort of tips and tactics that you can use to kind of help open up that conversation with somebody that maybe is sort of feeling like they can't really say anything because they're stuck on a Zoom call with somebody?
I think that if we're talking, it is a bit different when we're in a workplace context than in our social and private lives. And actually in the workplace context, there are a lot more tools and ways that we can really nurture a culture of openness around the subject of mental health. But you have to really get those kind of foundations in place. So companies that are doing this successfully, and I think this is the secret sauce, like doing all this first, because if you don't have a culture that's open and where there's psychological safety, and where people don't feel that they're going to be discriminated against, then that virtual conversation is going to be even harder. But if you're creating a culture where people know that this is a subject that's is spoken about openly, that there's support on hand for people, that nobody's going to be judged, then it's much easier to do like what we were saying in those other examples, to just kind of check in, how are you doing, over Zoom in the same way that you would do in person. I'm happy to go into some of those examples. I'm not sure if that's, helpful right now or later in the discussion of how to kind of create that culture that really nurtures an openness around mental health. But I mean, just a couple of things I can say about examples I hear from employers about Zoom is a lot of employers have created coffee chats they're like established, different times when you can just pop in and have a coffee catch up, and it's really encouraged that people talk about anything that they're struggling with. If they're wellbeing champions across the organization, there are people they're a safe place that you could go to talk to somebody who is going to have a non-judgmental ear. If it's a direct report or a colleague, I mean, I think, again, that goes back to setting the culture on a team or within an organization that we care about each other and we want to check in. And if there are signs if somebody turns off their camera a lot, or there are signs that someone might be struggling, that we kind of have an open dialogue and an acceptance amongst one another, that we are going to have kind of some accountability with each other and check in and see how we're doing, because we care. I think people can be kind of scared if it comes out of the blue, like all of a sudden, So I think investing in the culture is the most important thing for a workplace to do.
And Toluwa, just to pick up on what Heather's saying there, you both actually mentioned trust. If somebody is going to genuinely talk about something that they're struggling with, then it's very important to be able to trust the person they're telling, so that it's not a work colleague that might go and gossip about them behind their back. Oh, so-and-so is really struggling. They told me this, but I'm telling you just in confidence, don't tell anybody else. Or to have a manager, at a more senior level that they know they can approach in confidence, and it's not going to affect their employment record and all the rest of it. How do we manage that and overcome that challenge, Toluwa?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it 100% is a challenge, even now, more so in the virtual world and remote, and people working remotely, etc. And I think this is where leaders in any organization have a lot to do with just being more intentional about this kind of conversations. So I think workshops on well-being, or even things like this Time to Talk, is using that, leveraging that, because it goes a long way to know that I'm not alone. People are actually facing this. One of the things that we do in my current organization, Multiverse, is like group coaching on your well-being and mental health, because again, it brings that sense of, actually, a lot of us are going through feelings of overwhelm, burnt out, etc., which can have a cause on our mental well-being. So I think there's a real piece there with how intentional are we putting this into our one-to-one times, or our team meetings, or away days, virtually or in person. How intentional are we with all of those kind of things? But to go back to the question about do we bring this up in virtual or in person? Again, I think, like to Heather's point, particular conversations of mental health, it's really about the other person that is going through that experience. And so one of the things I found, even with wellbeing coaching, is a lot of people have opened up more virtually than they did when I was working face to face with a lot of individuals and organizations. And that might just be because they're in the comfort of their own home, they feel safer, whatever that might be. But I think there's loads of opportunities to talk about mental health, regardless of in person or virtually. It's just how we go about it, how intentional we are. Heather was talking about the strategies there in place. I think loads of opportunities for us that is a benefit, both in person and, of course, virtual as well.
Heather, does it matter? So I know we're still sort of very much focusing on the workplace here, but is it important that the management buy into what's happening, and that they can maybe be honest about what they go through? Because they'll people in senior positions will struggle with things just as much as somebody who's employed by them or whatever. Does it help if a company is shown to be living that culture by the senior management being more open with their employees about the stresses that they face, or do employees just think, well, they're just saying that to kind of, try and make me feel better?
I absolutely, in terms of setting the culture within any organization, leadership really sets a culture. So this is, probably if we have, the bog standard 5 things that you must do in, in a workplace wellbeing strategy, it's having your leadership on board, exec sponsorship of, a workplace mental health or wellbeing agenda. And taking it to the next level, yes, is leaders opening up and, not only introducing the subject into the company's culture, which so many leaders have been doing over the past 2 years of, some of the largest multinationals, leaders have been talking about their own experiences of mental health down to, SMEs. So when you see, a leader or a manager sharing about their own experiences, it just shatters like, that thick layer of glass. There's still stigma below that, but it's like a relief to people. It's kind of that superhuman thing again that I was saying earlier about athletes or professional athletes. So we just think that, people like leaders are also, they can manage anything, but no, actually it's been a tough 2 years, but also I think we're all realizing that we all have mental health. So this is something that wasn't the case necessarily before in workplace environment. So I absolutely agree that yes, leaders speaking up about mental health, encouraging that this is an open communication campaign that's going throughout the year and supporting that, participating in webinars like this within organizations. It's hugely beneficial, and staff absolutely take it seriously. It's so important.
Yeah. Toluwa, so let's sort of maybe move away from the workplace slightly and just look at those individual relationships, with families and family and friends. One of the things that I was looking at in terms of the resources on the Time to Talk website, which is a sort of campaign website for this, it was things like, don't feel that you've got to fix somebody by having that conversation. You can't fix somebody's mental health problem necessarily. You don't need to go in with a big boot, do you, to do this? It's just a gentle coaxing. And, you might not even be, you might be out for a run like I do. I'll go out and have a run and I'll just, be looking at the countryside, but chatting with a friend. And through that, you kind of work through what your week's been like. It's even just simple stuff like that, isn't it, that can help?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it just goes back to just having 2, 3, whoever's in the room, but just having that open space. Because at least in my own personal experience, what I found is even just talking out loud with whatever is going on in my mind in itself is helpful. And you have that other person who is present and paying attention to you and listening to what you're going to. In itself is very powerful. So things like, oh, let's go for a walk, and you can have a talk, or suggesting runs, exercise, all of that is important. But I think particularly just knowing the relationship you have with someone, and if that's the first time you've ever spoken about mental health, or if this is something that you speak about all the time, because all relationships look different. So for example, with my best friend, the way we talk about mental health is really different to the way I'll talk about it, I don't know, with my child or with my partner, right? So everyone has a role to play. But at the same time, there's like huge value in just creating that space for people, and knowing when to say, okay, there are resources here, because sometimes people don't need that solution. And so it's also just knowing when in that gender relationship, if this is something you talk about every single time, it can be maybe, it's a trend that you're noticing and saying, actually, I found this resource online on Time to Talk. I just wondered if you wanted to have a look. Or if it's the first time, maybe all you want to do in that conversation is just listen. So again, I think for the other person who is just there to be present, is just being able to engage with the person by creating that space, and then you can take it from there.
And Heather, do you agree there's, pointing people to something that might be useful if the conversation does go that way, or just being a listening ear?
I think it depends on the situation and on the relationship. So if we're talking about, between friends, then I think I'd feel more comfortable sharing resources just because I know that person well, and it wouldn't feel like I'm, I don't know, forcing something. In a workplace situation, there's a lot of training around this really for managers, because it is there is a boundary of like what managers should be responsible for versus what, in terms of signposting and kind of supporting someone versus when somebody maybe needs to go to get support from an EAP or HR. So I think in a workplace context, you have to be a little bit more careful about what resources to share with folks. But I do think that pointing people in the direction, there are clever ways that you can kind of do that too, where it may not feel forceful, can be helpful. But I also wanted to suggest another tip, which is something that I work with a lot of my clients, like introducing this tool, and done this on teams that I've managed as well. Really, really simple, but it's a check-in. How are you doing today between 1 and 10? And you can do that in one-to-ones. You can do that, and I also definitely suggested in team meetings, and everybody participates. And then you set a rhythm. You kind of set a precedent that this is something we do. It's normal, and then people share open and honestly. I promise you, because I've been doing this for a long time, and you get to know people and kind of their rhythms, and then you kind of start sharing like, okay, well, if you want to share like why you're maybe a 2 today versus you were 8 last week, we give space for that. And it's a really helpful way. And it's, again, we don't have to say it's mental health, but everyone kind of knows we're talking about well-being on the whole, or like how you're doing. And it's a pretty neutral way to check in with people. Highly recommend it, even between friends and family. I do it with everyone.
Yeah, I know there was one friend who said that I think their law firm, they don't sort of do it as a chat about mental health, but they maybe like share some recipes ahead of the weekend. So they have a Friday get together, and they come, somebody will come up with something nice that everybody could maybe try out to cook over the next week or whatever. It's not actually saying we're talking about how we're feeling, but it's a lovely way of getting people together to just have that kind of social moment during the week where it's not a meeting about another job that you've got on for a client.
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad that you touched on that. And I think, Jane, you and I spoke about this a little before, but social well-being is just so important. We're social animals, humans. We do need social interaction in order for us to have a balanced mental well-being. And so this is something where people have really struggled the past couple of years. Lots of research that says this, of course, and workplaces where, look at us, we're all at home alone, right? Like right now. And so, I think getting together and having these opportunities, it doesn't have to be about, oh, this is for our mental health or for having conversations, but that actually happens naturally when people get together. You build trust, you're doing something active, you're socializing. So people might, they might like just feel more comfortable to open up, and also just talking about like men as well, where it can be really hard. They have something called men's sheds. I think this was started in Australia in the construction industry, but it's been really successful. It's just it's a place where kind of guys know they can go, and it's like a little tool room or like a shed, and go and have a chat, or have a walk and talk, things like this as well, just to create that space, space for people to feel trust and safe to share. And then and things can come up naturally that way.
Yeah, I think it's Andy's men's sheds or men's club in this country, and it's a very similar. They're dotted around all around the country, and fantastic places for guys to go. And apologies to everybody who was tuning in to hear Mark what Mark was going to say, but we will get Mark back on another day. So I guess we're sort of coming up to the half hour. So can we sort of kind of round off with some real practical tips that people could take away from this, just to help those conversations along? Toluwa, I know that you were telling me sort of before this chat about the fact that you were working in a very stressful job, dealing with lots of sort of global kind of issues in the work that you did, and the stresses of that made you realize that you needed to have these conversations with yourself almost, and that's brought you into the work that you do. So are there things that you've learned through that journey that you would like to sort of pass on today?
Absolutely. I'm so happy you brought that up, Jane, because I think even to have a conversation, you also have to know how you're feeling, and to notice. And I think noticing is so powerful of the emotions that you're feeling. So if you're waking up every single day a little bit anxious than normal, a little bit low than normal, that is your body's telling you something. And sometimes you just need to notice to then share with someone that you trust and say, I don't really know what is happening. Does this happen to you? But even sleep is a story that your body's trying to tell you. So I think definitely noticing and then naming what that emotion is goes a long way. So the tip there is really about self-awareness, to then have that conversation. But I just wanted to echo as a second tip for other people doing that conversation, what Heather was saying in terms of scale of 1 to 10. So powerful, hugely powerful to start those conversations, even if you're not really sure how to have it. If someone says a 2, it's like, okay, on a normal day, is it normally a 2 or is it a 3? Is it a 4? What are some of those things that are underneath that number? So yeah, those would be, at least self-awareness would be the top thing I would start with as individuals.
And Heather, that you were responsible for creating that kind of index that we've talked about there. Is that something that is a practical application both in the workplace and in the rest of your life?
I mean, the Mind Workplace Wellbeing Index is very specifically focused on workplaces, and what best practice looks like in creating a culture that supports workplace mental health. So of course, awareness raising is a huge part of that, which is what Toluwa was just talking about. Essentially, is educating people how to understand and know themselves better, and to spot signs and symptoms in themselves, to be educated on how to spot signs and symptoms in others, to actually learn how to have these conversations. Things like that is really important. Of course, these are things that Mind advocates, but I think in terms of a message I want to relay, which I think is just hugely important, is having empathy. Is that all of us really need to just be conscientious about the experiences of other people. And I think they say you walk in someone else's shoes, but we all have mental health, and we are all, there's a spectrum of mental health, and it goes up and down, and of course it's more some people struggle more than others, but we can all imagine what a bad day was like for us once, or when we maybe experienced a traumatic event in our lives, the loss of a loved one, or COVID. I mean, there've been a lot of difficult things we've all been facing in the past few years. So just really embodying and practicing empathy with people when you invite a conversation, or when you hold space for someone to talk about their mental health, and consider like how you would want someone to respond to you, and what you'd maybe want to be, what you'd want to hear from them when you start those conversations. I think it's really beneficial.
Lovely. Heather and Toluwa, thank you so much. I'm sure we could kind of carry on the conversation for a long while, which is essentially what this is all about anyway. So it's been lovely to talk to you both today. And hopefully we can catch up with Mark again at some stage in the future. Thank you for joining us. And I hope to everybody who's tuned in that we've given you some practical tips to encourage more open conversations about mental health with the people that you know and that you work with. If you'd like to find a little bit more out about what we do at Frog Systems, you can visit our website and follow us on social media. We'll be putting the recording of this conversation up on our YouTube channel shortly. So please do share that with anyone that you think it might help. Enjoy the rest of your day and do please keep talking.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.